and welcome. My name is Alan, and we are here for more Executive Branch Supreme Court. And, this was meant to be Friday's video. I'm falling so far behind, it's ridiculous. I do apologize, guys. Anyway, before we jump into the video, you got two ways to donate to the channel as always. We've got a Patreon account, which is a monthly, month-to-month donation system, and then we got a coffee account, which can do much the same, but also allows you to make single one-time donations. Links to both will be in the description box below the video. In financial trouble or donating would put you there, please do not donate. Take care of what you need to take care of first. Hard enough on everybody right now with the idiots in charge. If you are able to afford it and donating won't hurt you, you wish to donate, thank you. I do appreciate it. It's me, myself, and I do the research, the filming, editing, posting, all that good stuff. I've personally sworn off doing commercials as a personal choice. And I make no money from the videos as of yet. Trying to remember the whole thing there. As that is now said and done, let's go ahead and jump into the video. Today we're taking a look at James Monroe in himself. 5th President of the United States. One of the last of the founding fathers who were president. When people often mention founding fathers, it's Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe. When it comes to the presidents, there's other founding fathers and other aspects dealing with Supreme Court, Congress, and the founding of the nation. But of that early line, James Monroe is the last of the presidents who fit that namesake. So yeah, President 1817 to 1825. March 4th, 1817 to March 4th, 1825. Of course, back in the day, we still inaugurated presidents much later in the year than we do now. Now it's like January 7th, 8th, or whatever. Because we get the information much quicker, much better. Even though we've got a lying cocksucker in fucking office. Who would tell you otherwise? Bastard ass, pedophile, president, piece of shit. Con man, warmonger, hate, fuck. But we're not here to talk about Donnie. As I said, we inaugurated presidents much later back then, March the 4th. Let's go ahead and take a look at Monroe as president. This is from the Miller Center at the University of Virginia. Full name, James Monroe. Born April 28, 1758, and died July 4th, 1831. Another fun fact about those first 5 presidents. 3 of them died July the 4th. Independence Day. Monroe, born in Westmoreland County, Virginia, educated at the College of William and Mary, graduating in 1776. Was of the Episcopalian religion, a lawyer, as were so many members of the founding fathers. They were in the fields of law. Some of them did other things, but a great majority you were going to see, and as you probably have seen thus far, were educated in the field of law. Was a part of the Democratic Republican Party, nicknamed the Last Cocked Hat, and the Era of Good Feelings President. Married Elizabeth Courtwright, February 16, 1786. She lived from 68 to 1830. And together they would have 3 children: Eliza Courtwright, 1786 to 1835; James Spence, 1799 to 1800, so of course died in infancy; and Maria Hester, 1803 to 1850. Inaugurated again March 4th, 1817 until March 4th, 1825. Fifth president, and would be buried at the Hollywood Cemetery of Richmond, Virginia. And it says, the last of the American presidents of the Virginia dynasty: Washington, Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe. 4 of those first 5. Of the first 5 men who held the position, 4 held from Virginia. Monroe had a long and distinguished public career as soldier, diplomat, governor, senator, and cabinet official. And his presidency, which began in 1817, lasted until 1825 and encompassed what came to be called the era of good feelings. Just because it was a time of peace and rather just simplicity, though there was a lot of things in it that weren't always good. One shouldn't assume, oh, this was a great. Generally, the people were happy, but it wasn't without its issues. One of his lasting achievements was the Monroe Doctrine, which became a major tenet of U.S. foreign policy in the Western Hemisphere. Again, the Monroe Doctrine was never meant to say we can interfere in southern nations. It was articulated in Monroe's 7th annual message to Congress on December the 2nd, 1823, and the European powers, according to Monroe, were obligated to respect the Western Hemisphere as the United States' specific sphere of interest. In 1823 annual message to Congress, it contained the Monroe Doctrine, which warned European powers not to interfere in the affairs of the Western Hemisphere, because as we know, one thing that Europe and nations like Russia and the such loved to do was establish colonies. And that, South America and North America were originally seen as just more colonization opportunities. And the U.S. was like, no more of this. No more just trying to colonize for your own personal want and greed. The Western Hemisphere is protected by the U.S. It is under our sphere of interest, influence, protection. Understandably, the U.S. had always taken a particular interest in its closest neighbors, the nations of the Western Hemisphere, and equally understandably, expressions of this concern have not always been favorably regarded by other American nations. Again, it wasn't originally meant to say, hey, we have the right to go in and knock out whoever we want. That was thanks to the fucking greed mongering, especially starting in the late 1800s. When you get into the Spanish-American Wars, your Teddy Roosevelts, your others, and then into the Cold War, where you say, oh, we gotta stop the spread of communism. Bullshit. Bullshit. The Monroe Doctrine is one of the best known U.S. policies toward the Western Hemisphere. Buried in a routine annual message delivered to Congress by Monroe in December of 1823, it warns European nations that the U.S. would not tolerate further colonization or puppet monarchs. The doctrine also conceived to meet major concerns of the moment, but it soon became a watchword of U.S. policy in the Western Hemisphere. The Monroe Doctrine was invoked in 1865 when the U.S. government exerted diplomatic and military pressure to support the Mexican president Benito Juarez, and the support enabled Juarez to lead a successful revolt against Emperor Maximilian, who had been placed on the leadership of Mexico by the French government, notably Napoleon III. The only emperor, I believe, of Mexico, Maximilian I. Almost 40 years later, in 1904, European creditors had a number of Latin American countries threatened armed intervention to collect debts, and President Teddy Roosevelt promptly proclaimed the right of the U.S. to exercise international police power to curb such chronic wrongdoing in his so-called Roosevelt corollary or extension to the Monroe Doctrine. Again, the Americas, as the U.S. saw it, were supposed to be under its protection, its influence. Europe, Russia, all you fuckers, keep the fuck out. We don't need any more of your colonization. That was essentially the idea. But, again, there's always the military greedy fucks. While the Monroe Doctrine's message was designed to keep European powers out of the Western Hemisphere, Roosevelt would strengthen its meaning to justify tending to the United States and other countries and the Western Hemisphere. As a result, U.S. Marines were sent into Santo Domingo in 1984, or 04, Nicaragua in 1911, and Haiti in 1915, ostensibly to keep Europeans out. Other Latin American nations viewed these interventions with misgiving, and translations between the Great Colossus of the North and relations between the Great Colossus of the North and the southern neighbors remained strained for many years. In 1962, the Monroe Doctrine was invoked symbolically when the Soviet Union began to build missile launching sites in Cuba. With support of the Organization of American States, President John F. Kennedy threw a naval and air quarantine around the island. After several tense days, the Soviet Union agreed to withdraw the missiles and dismantle the sites. Subsequently, the U.S. dismantled several of its obsolete air and missile bases in Turkey. At the proposal of the Russian imperial government made through the minister of the emperor residing here, a full power and instructions have been transmitted to the minister of the United States at St. Petersburg to arrange by amicable negotiation the respective rights and interests of the two nations on the northwest coast of this continent. A similar proposal has been made by His Imperial Majesty to the government of Great Britain, which has likewise been acceded to. The government of the United States has been desirous by this friendly proceeding of manifesting the great value which they have invariably attached to the friendship of the emperor and their solicitude to cultivate the best understanding with his government. In the discussions to which this interest has given rise, and in the arrangements by which they may terminate the occasion, has been judged proper for asserting, as a principle in which the rights and interests of the United States are involved, that the American continents, by the free and independent condition which they have assumed and maintained, are henceforth not to be considered as subjects for future colonization by any European powers. It was stated at the commencement of the last session that a great effort has been in making Spain and Portugal to improve their condition of the people of those countries, and that it appeared to be conducted with extraordinary moderation. It not need scarcely be remarked that the results have been so far very different from what was then anticipated. Of events in that quarter of the globe with which we have so much intercourse, and from which we derive our origin, we have always been anxious and interested spectators. The citizens of the United States cherish sentiments the most friendly in favor of the liberty and happiness of their fellow men on the side of the Atlantic. In the wars of the European powers in matters relating to themselves, we have never taken any part, nor does it comport with our policy to do so. It is only when our rights are invaded or seriously menaced that we resent injuries or make preparation for our defense. With the movements in this hemisphere, we are of necessity more immediately connected, and by causes which must be obvious to all enlightened and impartial observers, the political system of the Allied powers is essentially different in this respect from that of America. This difference proceeds from that which exists in their respective governments, and to the defense of our own, which has been achieved by the loss of so much blood and treasure, and matured by the wisdom of their enlightened citizens, and under which we have enjoyed unexampled felicity. This whole nation is devoted. We owe it, therefore, to candor and to the amicable relations existing between the United States and those powers, to declare that we should consider any attempt on their part to extend their system to any portion of this hemisphere as dangerous to our peace and safety. With the existing colonies or dependencies of any European power, we have not interfered and shall not interfere, but with the governments who have declared their independence and maintain it, and whose independence we have, on great consideration and on just principles, acknowledged, we could not view any interposition for the purpose of oppressing them, or controlling in any other manner their destiny by any European power in any other light than as the manifestation of an unfriendly opposition toward the United States. In the war between those new governments and Spain, we declared our neutrality at the time of their recognition, and to this we have adhered, and shall continue to adhere, provided no exchange shall occur which, in the judgment of the competent authorities of this government, shall make a corresponding exchange to the part of the United States indispensable to their security. The late events in Spain and Portugal shew that Europe is still unsettled. Of this important fact, no stronger proof can be adduced than that of the Allied powers should have thought it proper, on any principle satisfactory to themselves, to have interposed by force in the internal concerns of Spain. To what extent such interposition may be carried on the same principle is a question in which all independent powers whose governments differ from those are interested, even those most remote, and surely none of them more so than the United States. Our policy in regard to Europe, which was adopted at an early stage of the wars which have so long agitated the quarter of the globe, nevertheless remains the same, which is not to interfere in the internal concerns of any of its powers, to consider the government de facto as the legitimate government for us, to cultivate friendly relations with it, and to preserve those relations by a frank, firm, and manly policy, meeting in all instances the just claims of every power, submitting to injuries from none. But in regard to those continents, circumstances are eminently and conspicuously different. It is impossible that the Allied powers should extend their political system to any portion of either continent without endangering our peace and happiness. Nor can anyone believe that our southern brethren, if left to themselves, would adopt it of their own accord. It is equally impossible, therefore, that we should behold such interposition in any form with indifference. If we look to the comparative strength and resources of Spain and those new governments and their distance from each other, it must be obvious that she can never subdue them. It is still the true policy of the United States to leave the parties to themselves, in hope that their powers will pursue the same course. But yeah, that's the actual written part of the Monroe Doctrine. But the biggest part right here is at the end of this first paragraph, in which he says, in the discussions to which the interest has given rise and the arrangements by which they may terminate the occasion has been judged proper for asserting as a principle in which the rights and interests of the U.S. are involved, that the American continents, North America, South America, Latin/Central America, by the free and independent condition that they have assumed and maintain, are henceforth not to be considered as subjects for future colonization by any European powers. Mexico has deemed independence, and there's a number of the countries in South America who are already striving for independence. So yeah. And that is the basis of the Monroe Doctrine. We've got a Wikipedia article here on it and how it's been used, though. It's not always been used as just, hey, stay out. It's also been used as an attempt to push our own ideas, especially, like I said, under the communist, oh, we don't want communism here, so we'll just dip our fingers into other countries. According to Samuel Eliot Morison, as early as 1783, The U.S. adopted the policy of isolation and announced its intention to keep out of Europe, and the supplementary principle of the Monroe Doctrine that Europe must keep out of America was still over the horizon. So, like, look, these countries also want independence, they want freedom, stay out. Much like the image here, it became a weapon, a bat. But yeah, the idea is, hey, protect South, Central, North America. Caribbean was all supposed to be part of it since it was in the Gulf, but there were still foreign entanglements there that not all of those had won their independence as of yet. But yeah. Let's see. The Now let's talk about one of the more controversial parts of many of our founding fathers. Despite how some were like, they seem to say we want to get rid of slavery, but we shouldn't do it. Let it happen on its own. And of course, that wasn't going to be happening thanks to a Southern group that was like, hey, that's where we make our money. Because honestly, the North was already industrialized, it was already making other things. It was the South, though, that was agrarian. And so, along with cotton, it grew a number of things, tobacco, that, yeah. Hey, it's much easier to have others do our work for us. Considered the last founding father, Monroe was born in 1758 into an affluent slave-owning family in Westmoreland County, Virginia. His parents, Spence and Elizabeth Monroe, had aspirations for their eldest son, sending him to Campbelltown Academy, and his childhood changed dramatically when both his parents passed away within a span of 2 years. In 1774, he inherited land and enslaved people from the estate of his father. Not even an adult yet. He was 16. I think that was 58, 68, 78. So yeah, 16 years of age. This turn of events compelled James to look after his siblings until his uncle, Joseph Jones, became a paternal surrogate for the Monroe children. Jones encouraged Monroe to attend the College of William and Mary, one of the 9 colleges to exist in the U.S. before the independence. Well, the 9 to exist before that still exists, I should say. You had all your Ivy League colleges you think of: Harvard, Yale, Brown, Princeton. I'm trying to think of the other ones because I know I've left some out. Harvard, Yale, Brown, Princeton. The 2 I'm forgetting, and then there's also what becomes Rutgers University and the College of William and Mary. Those are considered the 8 oldest colleges, universities in the U.S. But yeah, he enrolled until he enlisted in the Continental Army's 3rd Virginia Infantry Regiment. In terms of military, political, administrative, and diplomatic experience, he was one of the most qualified individuals to ascend to the presidency during the 19th century. Yeah, fought in the Revolutionary War, served in political situations a lot, was a lawyer, was what he learned to be, and he would also be ministers to other nations for our presidents. He fought in the American Revolution, wounded at the Battle of Trenton, served in the legislative bodies of the Virginia General Assembly and the United States Senate, was also governor of Virginia, held diplomatic posts across Europe for different administrations, and served as the Secretary of State and Secretary of War briefly, acting in both capacities during the James Madison administration. He also studied law with Thomas Jefferson, and the two men became very good friends. In fact, because of his relationship with Jefferson, Monroe purchased land adjacent to Monticello in Albemarle County. His plantation would be named Highland, and the Monroes, along with a growing enslaved community, lived there from 1799 until 1823. So you have Monticello, the Jefferson home, and then right across from it, Highland, the Monroe home. That same year, Monroe was elected governor, and during this tenure, he and other Virginia slave owners experienced one of the largest attempted insurrections in United States history. And we'll be talking about some more incidents, but yeah, on August 30th, 1800, Governor Monroe received alarming news that a slave rebellion was forming in the countryside just outside the capital of Richmond. Gabriel, an enslaved blacksmith who lived on Thomas Prosser's plantation in Henrico County, had organized and inspired about 150 others to take up arms against their enslavers. Two co-conspirators, Pharaoh and Tom, confessed the plot to their owner, Mosby Shepherd, who then alerted the governor. Monroe ordered up the militia to patrol the city and safeguard the caches of arms and munitions. A torrential downpour delayed the start of the insurrection, as word spread about the patrols, Gabriel's followers fled and went into hiding. Over the course of the next 2 days, Virginia militiamen terrorized hundreds of enslaved people in and around Richmond by breaking into the quarters and cabins of anyone suspected of conspiring with Gabriel. Most were innocent and only dealt with having their homes invaded and searched, which is against the Fourth Amendment, search and seizure, I believe. But more than 70 others were arrested and charged. On September the 12th, 5 enslaved men, Will, John, Isaac, Michael, and Ned, were executed in Richmond for their roles in the attempted rebellion. 3 days later, another 5 men, Solomon, Billy, Martin, Charles, and Frank, were also executed. As the second group was heading to the gallows, Monroe sought Vice President Jefferson's advice on the severity of these punishments. Where to arrest the hand of the executioner is a question of great importance. It is hardly to be presumed a rebel who avows it was his intention to assassinate his master, and can, if pardoned, will ever become a faithful servant. And we have no power to transport him abroad. Nor is it less difficult to say whether mercy or severity is a better policy in this case, though where there is cause for doubt, it is best to incline to the former counsel. Writing from Monticello, Jefferson observed that there is a strong sentiment that if there has been hanging enough that other states and world at large will forever condemn us if we indulge a principle of revenge or go one step beyond absolute necessity. In the end, 72 enslaved men were prosecuted, 26 of whom were convicted and executed, including Gabriel. 8 were transported to New Orleans to be sold, 25 were acquitted, and 13 were ultimately pardoned by Governor Monroe. But the incident spurred the Virginia General Assembly to pass severe measures to control the free and enslaved African American communities. One of the changes enacted was allowing transportation as a substitute punishment for certain capital crimes. Based on his writings afterwards, the event shifted Monroe's attitudes towards slavery. It is also possible that this episode and the solution of transportation was the origin of his future support for colonization. Several years later, President Jefferson entrusted Monroe and Robert Livingston to acquire territory from France and secure American access across the Mississippi River and the port of New Orleans in what would become the Louisiana Purchase. The men exceeded all expectations, acquiring New Orleans and some 827,000 square miles west of the Mississippi for only $15 million. The Louisiana Purchase opened up the new opportunities for white settlers, often at the expense of Native Americans who had lived on these lands for centuries. But it also created a volatile mix of expansionism and slavery. The intertwined issues remained at the forefront of American politics for the next 60 years. Yeah, because it's like, well, we can't have all of them being slave states. Well, we want some slave states to cover because, you can't have them all be free. And of course, you had the argument slave state to free state. So it was one per for a while. And of course, we got the Missouri Compromise and all this bullshit that happens. After he completed his diplomatic assignment in Great Britain, Monroe returned to his private life at Highland. Between 1807 and 1810, he acquired 33 additional enslaved people. According to the 1810 census, there were 49 enslaved individuals at Highland, making Monroe one of the county's largest slave owners. While he was often away for business or public service, the enslaved carpenters, blacksmiths, maids, cooks, and field workers sustained the plantation during his frequent absences. After serving as Secretary of State in war under Madison, Monroe emerged as his political successor and easily won the 1816 election at the beginning of his presidency. Lived at the Caldwell House located at 2017 I Street Northwest. This property featured a 3-story brick mansion along the kitchen wing, garden, stables, and carriage house. He had lived there until his tenure of Secretary of State, and remained there temporarily as the White House was still being built under supervision of the Irish-born architect James Monroe. Monroe brought several enslaved women to Washington, possibly to work at the Caldwell House or prepare another house for occupancy. Unfortunately, they were never identified by name. They likely would have cooked, cleaned, and attended to the President and First Lady, as well as many guests who visited with the Monroes. On May the 31st, Monroe embarked on a grand tour of the northern U.S. to examine fortifications, inspect troop detachments, and inspire national fervor. In June 1817, these unidentified women were sent back to the Monroe property in Albemarle County, likely where they, because of the president's extended trip away from Washington. Monroe returned to the capital on September the 17th, 1817. A large group of citizens, troops, and dignitaries escorted the president from Georgetown to the president's house, where he delivered an address to the public and ceremoniously took up residence, though the home wasn't quite ready yet. Just as he relied on enslaved people at Highland and Caldwell House, he also relied on enslaved labor at the White House. There are surviving household accounts that identify some of the enslaved individuals who worked in the Monroe White House during his first term in office, and 3 enslaved women, Sucky, Eve, Betsy, were mentioned because of expenses related to shoes and medical care. 4 enslaved men, Daniel, Tom, Peter, and Hartford, were listed because of expenditures related to shoes and clothing. Unfortunately, these records were only kept during Monroe's summers away from Washington and tell us very little about who these people were and their responsibilities to the White House. And we have a list of them who tended to Monroe. The 1820 census reveals that there were 5 enslaved men, 1 enslaved woman, 2 free African American men, and 3 foreigners not naturalized, likely hired servants or staff. 2 possibilities are Charles Bizet, the president's gardener who was born in France, and Steward Joseph Jeter, who, while Jeter's origins are unclear, many early 19th century White House stewards came from Europe and were considered superior to their American counterparts. Employing a mix of free and enslaved domestic staff was common practice by then, as Washington, Jefferson, and Madison had already done so. While we can speculate somewhat about who these white workers were, the identities of the 6 enslaved individuals and 2 free African Americans are currently unknown. It is also possible that some of the enslaved individuals recorded in the 1820 census were in fact those identified earlier in the article that he brought to Caldwell House. While we do not know their names, these enslaved individuals likely would have lived downstairs in the basement, as the level featured a kitchen, laundry, and other adjoining service spaces. There is also evidence that enslaved labor was used for a number of projects on the White House grounds during Monroe's presidency. While the exact moment is unknown, Monroe began to contemplate possible solutions to end the institution of slavery, and he was a nationalist, primarily concerned about preserving the Republic. He recognized that slavery fostered sectional animosity, and these tensions were a persistent threat to a rather delicate union. He believed that abolishing slavery was probably necessary to ensure the survival of the country. However, he also had many concerns about the logistics and possible consequences of emancipation. Would it be immediate or gradual? What role would the federal government play in the process? Would slave owners be compensated? What support or security would formerly enslaved individuals receive? How would labor markets, politics, and white society react to a large and growing population of free African Americans? Again, kicking that can down the road instead of trying to enact something. There was always that worry. We don't want to rock the boat because we fear this may lead to a decimation of what is our nation. Ultimately, Monroe believed that the gradual compensated emancipation and colonization was the best solution, and as president, he broadly pursued this approach or this policy. This approach also meant that he did not envision a U.S. with African Americans in it. This premise was rooted in the dual belief that African Americans were incapable of assimilating into American society and that whites would never accept their newfound status. He gradually became more supportive of colonization during his presidency, and this evolution went hand in hand with the president's efforts to suppress the African slave trade, as colonization could not happen if more Africans, legally and illegally, were being forcibly transported to the Western Hemisphere. Working in conjunction with the efforts of the American Colonization Society, a settlement was established on the west coast of Africa named Liberia, its capital city later named Monrovia. So yeah, colonization, he's a fan of colonization, of colonizing the rest of America. Because we've had this expansion under Jefferson with the New Orleans or the Louisiana Purchase. Our growth and control of the nation is just booming. So he's like, colonize, expand further out. So yeah. But again, that this stupid belief that, oh, blacks and whites can't live together, he creates an actual place in Africa, an actual settlement named Liberia. I think Liberia is still there as a nation, and its capital would be named after him, Monrovia. He also pursued a treaty with Great Britain to declare the slave trade an act of piracy. This agreement would have permitted both countries to search and seize ships suspected of trafficking Africans. The treaty eventually faltered in the Senate, and the president rebuked Congress for its inaction in December of 1823, arguing that this measure would ensure the end of the African slave trade. It was also worth mentioning that ending the African slave trade would increase the value of enslaved people already in the United States, including those owned by Monroe, and serve as a boon to the domestic slave trade. Earlier that year, he estimated that he owned around 60 or 70 young and old male and female slaves between his properties in Loudoun and Albemarle counties, and while he perceived slavery as a danger to the Union, he also realized that enslaved people were his source of wealth, and like many of his contemporaries, refused to surrender that status willingly. During his retirement, he continued to demonstrate a strong interest in colonization, westward expansion, and was elected honorary president of the auxiliary chapter of the Colonization Society of Virginia, yet he never took substantial steps to either free those he enslaved or arrange their transportation to Liberia. As his health declined in early 1831, he divided his estate between his daughters Eliza and Maria, and later made a dying request that was previously unknown until the discovery of two significant historical documents: a recommendation to employ Peter Marks, his enslaved manservant, and a certification acknowledging Peter's freedom. To date, Peter is the only known individual who was freed by James Monroe. So clearly, Marks meant a lot to Monroe himself. He's like, free him, but give him employee. We have been able to recover the names of a handful of enslaved people from Monroe's papers and contemporary sources, but much of the story is still missing. And at Monroe's Highland, staff are working closely with descendants of the enslaved community to transform the site's interpretation. Two independent researchers are currently tracing the lineage of several enslaved families that were sold and sent to a plantation in Florida. To learn more about the project, click there. The editorial staff of the papers of James Monroe are working to publish selected correspondence and are currently working on volumes 8 and 9, which will chronicle his presidential terms in greater detail and provide new research leads into the people who worked in the president's household. To learn more about the Monroe Papers Project, they've got another link. As new volumes are published, they hope to learn more about the enslaved individuals who worked and lived at the Monroe White House. This article was published 2020, so it's not stained by the idiot we've got in charge. But it gives us a good look. Like I said, as with the other founding fathers, especially the Virginia founding fathers, Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, they could tell slavery was bad. They shouldn't be enslaving people, but it gave a lot of people wealth, a lot of people power. Like I said, many of them were, but I don't want to rock the boat. And we just never quite got rid of slavery. But yeah, if you're more interested about the Gabriel's Rebellion that we talked about earlier, I have an article here from the James Monroe Museum, which is part of a college, university. I'm not sure who it is. It says UMW. I would imagine in Virginia somewhere. It's not William and Mary because it should be UWM, or WNM, because technically it still calls itself a college, College of William and Mary, not a university. But yeah, information on the Gabriel Rebellion, if you want to read into that a bit. I won't be reading it here just because we're already so far in and there's still more to get into. Because we're already close to an hour in. I want to at least see if we can get a little bit here. We read that. From the Miller Center at the University of Virginia, James Monroe's Life in Brief. The last American president of the Virginia dynasty, the first five men who held the position, all four held from Virginia. We talked about that. This same paragraph is the same one we read in the last thing. Early revolutionary. Monroe, born in 1758 to prosperous Virginia planters, and his parents died when he was a teenager, leaving him part of the family farm. He enrolled at the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia in 1774. So the tensions to a Revolutionary War at this point are already building, but he's going to college. It's not fully a war yet. but there's already been clashes, battles, and almost immediately he began participating in revolutionary activities. With a group of classmates, he raided the arsenal at the British governor's palace, escaping with 200 muskets and 300 swords, which the students presented to the Virginia militia. He became an officer in the Continental Army in early 1776 and shortly thereafter joined General George Washington's army in New York. Severely wounded at the Battle of Trenton, promoted to captain and then major, and assigned to the staff of General William Alexander, where he served for more than a year. After resigning his commission in the Continental Army in 1779, he was appointed colonel in the Virginia service. In 1780, Governor Thomas Jefferson sent Monroe to North Carolina to report on the advance of the British. After the war, Monroe studied law with Jefferson and was elected to the Continental Congress in 1783. While a delegate to the Congress been meeting in New York, he meets his future wife, Elizabeth Courtwright, daughter of a New York City merchant. A year later, they were married. He was 27, she was 17. The newlyweds moved to Fredericksburg, Virginia, where Monroe practiced law. In 1787, he began serving in the Virginia Assembly and was chosen the following year as a delegate to the Virginia Convention considering ratification of the new U.S. Constitution. He voted against ratification, so he didn't approve of the Constitution. Interesting. Holding out for a direct election of presidents and senators, and for the inclusion of a Bill of Rights. So he was like, I don't like this electoral college. It should be direct election. Senators, presidents should be elected directly by the people. But we've still got an electoral college to this day, something we need to get rid of. Monroe was right on that. And the Bill of Rights, correct again. Partly due to politicians such as Monroe, who brought attention to the omission of such constitutional guarantees, the Bill of Rights became the first 10 amendments of the Constitution upon ratification in 1791. Although Monroe narrowly lost a congressional election to James Madison in 1790, the Virginia state legislature appointed him to the U.S. Senate. As a member of that body, he allied himself with Madison and Thomas Jefferson, his close personal friends, against a Federalist faction led by Vice President John Adams and Secretary of Treasury Alexander Hamilton. In 1794, President Washington sent Monroe to Paris as U.S. Minister to France, and his actions as minister angered the Federalists, however, and Washington recalled him in 1797. In 1799, he was elected governor of Virginia and served 3 one-year terms, so 3 years altogether. In 1803, President Thomas Jefferson sent him back to France to help negotiate the Louisiana Purchase. Monroe continued to serve his government, Jefferson's, in Europe, representing the U.S. as a U.S. minister in Britain from 1803 to 1807, with a brief stint as special envoy to Spain in 1805. After he returned home, dissident Republicans nominated him to oppose James Madison for the Democratic Republican presidential nomination in 1808. Monroe, however, never considered the challenge serious, and Madison won the election easily. Monroe was once again elected governor of Virginia in January 1811, but headed back to Washington, D.C. that April when Madison, as president, named him Secretary of State. He would serve in that capacity and also for a time as Secretary of War until 1817. So yeah, basically throughout the rest of Madison's presidency. Easy race to the White House. When Madison announced his decision to continue the custom of serving only 2 terms, because remember, our presidents up to that point, George Washington, 2 terms. John Adams, 1 term. Thomas Jefferson, 2 terms. James Madison, 2 terms. Monroe, 2 terms. Monroe became the logical candidate for the Democratic Republicans. After some maneuvering within the party, he prevailed to win the nomination and had little opposition during the general election campaign. The Federalists were so out of favor with the public that a majority had abandoned the party name altogether. They ultimately nominated New York's Rufus King, but the result was a foregone conclusion. In the Electoral College, Monroe carried 16 states to King's 3. Monroe began the presidency by embarking on a presidential tour, a practice initiated by President George Washington. His trip through the northern states took 15 weeks, by which time more Americans had seen him than they had any other sitting president. A newspaper in Boston described Monroe's reception there as the beginning of a new era of good feelings for the nation. The president later made 2 similar tours, one of Chesapeake Bay area in 1818 and one of the South and West in 1819. The era of good feelings. At the beginning of Monroe's presidency, the nation had much to feel good about. It had declared victory in the War of 1812, although honestly, that war, you can't really call it a victory. You can declare victory because neither side really came out good, but we still got our asses beat. But that and the economy was booming, allowing the administration to turn its attention toward domestic issues. The economy was booming. The organized opposition in the form of Federalists had faded largely from sight, although the government had adopted many Federalist programs, including protective tariffs and a national bank. The president, moreover, was personable, extremely popular, and interested in reaching out to all the regions of the country. He faced his first crisis as president with the Panic of 1819, which resulted in high unemployment as well as increased foreclosures and bankruptcies. Some critics derided Monroe for not responding more forcefully to the Depression, although he believed that such troubles were natural for a maturing economy and that the situation would soon turn around. He could do little to alleviate their short-term effects. Monroe's second crisis came at the same year when the entrance of Missouri to the Union as a slave state threatened to disrupt the legislative balance between the North and South, like we talked about earlier, where it was divided between slave states and free states. Congress preserved that equilibrium, negotiating a compromise in which Massachusetts allowed its northernmost counties to apply for admission to the Union as a free state of Maine. The Missouri Compromise also called for the prohibition of slavery in the western territories of the Louisiana Purchase above the 3630 north latitude line. Monroe worked in support of the compromise, and after ascertaining that the provisions were constitutional, signed the bill. In trying to sustain the era of good feelings, he had hoped to preside over the decline of political parties. However, the administration offered only a brief respite from divisive partisan politics. The rancor surrounding the 1824 presidential election was a reminder that strong feelings still animated American political life, even without the existence of two distinct parties. In fact, the Monroe presidency stood at the forefront of the transition from the first party system of the Democratic Republicans and the Federalists to the second party system of the Democrats and the Whigs. So, yeah. And it was that 1824 presidency, or presidential election, I should say, that was the moment of the corrupt bargain, and where Andrew Jackson cut a hissy fit, telling Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams, "This is a corrupt bargain," and whined like a trump, a bitch. Spanish Florida and Monroe Doctrine. In 1818, Monroe sent General Andrew Jackson to Spanish Florida to subdue the Seminole Indians who were raiding American settlements, and liberally interpreting his vague instructions, Jackson led his troops deep into areas of Florida under the control of Spain and captured two Spanish forts. In addition to securing greater protection for American settlements, the mission pointed out the vulnerability of Spanish rule in Florida. Monroe and his Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, used that vulnerability to pressure Spain into selling Florida to the United States. As Spain's dominion in the Americas continued to disintegrate, revolutions throughout its colonies brought independence to Argentina, Peru, Chile, Colombia, and Mexico. When European powers threatened to form an alliance to help Spain regain its lost domains, Monroe, with a prodding of Secretary of State Adams, declared that America would resist European intervention in the Western Hemisphere. Announced in the President's message to Congress on December the 2nd, 1823, the Monroe Doctrine thus became a cornerstone in American foreign policy. Leaving Washington after a lifetime of public service, Monroe and his wife retired to their estate in Loudoun County, Virginia. Monroe returned to private life deeply in debt and spent many of his later years trying to resolve his financial problems. He petitioned the government to repay him for past services with the government, eventually providing a portion of the amount he sought. After his wife died in 1830, Monroe moved to New York City to live with his daughter. He died there July 4th, 1831. So just a year after his wife. Maybe not even a full year, because didn't say exactly when in 1830. This video's been a long one, but yeah, we covered quite a bit, and we've still got a lot we can look at. There's the Wikipedia articles, like I said, the presidency of James Monroe and James Monroe himself. There's Gabriel's Rebellion article you can read if you want to read into it. But yeah, James Monroe. Again, one of these figures who a lot of what he did was good, but he could not bring himself to end one of the greatest errors in American history, slavery. The greatest error. Not just one of, but the greatest. We'll go ahead and end this episode here. As always, educate thyself. Think, read, study, learn. Someone tells you something you have trouble believing, ask them to cite their sources. And it can't be a bunch of tinfoil hat-wearing sources or anecdotes thrown together to try to make sources. I'll be putting my links and sources in the description box below the video. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you all in the next one. Until then, later.